Hello everyone, today we talk about the Italian state's artillery during the Italian wars for our Renaissance armies series. I'm resuming a bit the sacred lottery due to the fact that it's good to intersperse as much homogeneously sorted, as randomly in that sense also sorted content than not. We recently made some videos about the Italian wars, 16th century warfare. The latest, most pertinent, was the role of mounted gunners in Giovanni de' Medici's Condotta, as a matter of fact. And that video was interesting because it showed how actually adaptive and even innovating Italians were from a tactical point of view, while their peninsula was, however, overrun by the majorly concentrated monarchic powers in Europe. All right, we really have to talk more about this phase and especially the Italian perspective on this from a military point of view, because as I found out also by preparing this videos about artillery, there is surprisingly very few historiographical work made on the topic. That is incredibly didactic in its paradox. Why? Because essentially Italy was the most technologically advanced country in Europe, together with Germany. Telling the truth, and the paradox here is interesting as well, because both countries were hopelessly fragmented. At least Germany was not conquered, or say in large part, by foreign powers, even though it was also a less desirable place to conquer in a sense. And in fact, these regions exhibited a substantial military quality in individual sort of aspects. The art of war, think about the Reiter. That's the point we made, in fact, in the video about the Condotta, the mounted gunners of Giovanni delle Bandiniere, that the Italian condottieri there prefigured essentially Reiter warfare, as it would develop basically reaching its peak a few decades after his death in the mid-16th century. And we saw naturally also the differences between these regions and made videos about Landsknecht, and recently made a video about the League of Schmalkald, as a matter of fact. So we observed how even they're like farraginous, deficient in many ways, like imperial policy at the regional level really was. Right, mostly the Habsburgs were counting on the Spanish, as we've seen also in our videos about Charles V's campaigns in Western Mediterranean against Tunis, against Algiers, etc. All right. At the same time, there's a bit of a further paradox here, because the bottom line, the actual narrative that historiography has nailed correctly, and this is also kind of notorious if you know the ABC of this period, is that the Italians, yes, were the most technologically advanced country out there, but at the same time were not politically cohesive at some point. Their city-states, as we've seen in the previous centuries, had been actually pioneering much of Western civilizational growth, expansion. Italian bankers at this point were heavily involved, paradoxically, in the same in financing the same sides that they took themselves, either from pro-France or Spain. In fact, the merchants of Lyon were actually Italian. The Bank of St. George that substituted the Fugge in subsidizing especially the Spanish crown as that Bavarian firm went bankrupt, as it also sort of often as randomly happened, considering the unknowns of war, given that the military expenses of this era, especially the Italian wars that continued shifting from Italy to Flanders, that will also remain, by the way, in the north, the more prolonged battlefield in later European history. At least the Italians got some rest after sort of the mid-16th century until basically the end of the 17th. Well, these powers had not been able to confederate in any meaningfully effective way. In their view, this is sort of very interesting topic, because it was naturally a great object of discussion historiographically. I made a video about Guicciardini last summer explaining that the myth that simply it was just purely about interest, and that the Italians in this sense really thought just individually as single states. It is true, but it's not true in the sense that it made the thing shipwreck in the way we intend. There was a fail to confederate, but if you look at this, for example, from the perspective of Venice or of Milan or the papacy, so they all had some different political range, sort of alliances, potential. Just think how, I don't know, the Serenissima was structured as mostly a maritime power as opposed to more land masses like the Milanese and the Papal one, that, however, were never as big cohesively as the French one or the Spanish one, that actually were territories not fully unified as we understand them today, but they had been able to put together that satisfactorily critical mass sufficient to successfully shift, in fact, the strategic balance in the peninsula in their favor. And the Italian wars were terrible in many ways because they were protracted over time. Like the most intense phase was between 1494 and 1525. Then there were other expeditions and so on, but mostly there was an asset was established in which, telling the truth, most Italian states maintained their own independence, all right, while others, and the most important ones to a degree of relative comparison to the others, Naples, but this was true from a much longer time as a vice kingdom, in any case, ruled by the local barons, so in truth, but in this sense, negotiating with the monarchy in a way that was not very institutionally beneficial, in fact, to the further development of that immense land. By the way, Milan, that had historically been the most advanced and the most sort of state-like power out there, Venice was basically frozen at this point. Did not lose any major territorial extension, but basically was prevented from attempting at essentially the hegemonization of the peninsula. We will have to talk more about the second half of the 14th and 15th century Italian history because we haven't quite covered well how that was really going, right? On YouTube, you have always this kind of stuff like it's either the Condottieri as some, oh, look, the story of this guy, or look, also the Italians and armies, or just like, because you have to cover a spectrum of sort of more pop, culturally heard topics in a certain sense. But the European balance at this point really passed through the peninsula, and that's why also the Italian wars were fought there, starting from there in the first place, right? The bottom line that I was getting to is the fact that, differently even from a relatively underrated country like Switzerland that had its millions of inhabitants and was mostly devoted to sort of lend its military forces for a general living and development, Switzerland had managed to occupy and control Milan at some point, and that fortunately they lost, right? Because had they continued, that the Switzerland would not be the one that it is today. I think it was really a fair trade, because I can't see much of a better alternative in any case. But in this sense, not just being smaller states, right? Italy was pretty big, but by those time standards altogether. But in the various states, like even the concept of recruiting, training, fielding, maintaining thousands of the newly kind of pike square troops necessary to successfully withstand, in fact, the militaries of Switzerland, of basically France in that case, as infantry mostly, and the Spanish tercios and even the German Landsknechten was absent. Right, the Italian population was very rich, was the richest per capita in the world. They were very involved in manufacture. There were important industries locally, including ones for arms and armor production. Think about Milan; it was the most advanced in Europe at that point. But that sort of militarizing army in fundamentally seigneurial powers that lacked a statale, they had actually a very strong statale core. The Italians had pioneered that in an important sense, but always remaining within this regional scale and mostly toughening up just against enemies of their own scale, because sort of major foreign invasions had not been there from significantly, basically 300 years or so. Had the Italians failed at the establishment, essentially, of a national power, right? The problem is mostly political. It's not even like they didn't have the armies or they couldn't put together that given sort of tens of thousands of men. They will actually, right? And actually, if you pick, I don't know, the naval power of Genoa and Venice alone, had these powers not hated one another, had not had sort of viable options to expand within the same context of the Italian wars, alone, by creating a blockade around Italy, would have sealed off the peninsula from any possible intervention alone, right? This is very easy. Like, put together, this was by far the most powerful place in Europe, but their political goals were very provincial and mostly seeking like short-term clashes for sort of very, in fact, provincial scale results, and or just maintaining the status quo and getting the protection even of this or that power. Because Italy actually had a long history of external, so foreign intervention protection, right? Even though, again, the attempted, probably an Italian conquest had ceased from quite a while, and during medieval times, it could be only essentially one of establishment, of elite, of regime. And this is in fact what partially happens as the outcome, the aftermath of the Italian wars. The proclivity of the states to essentially depend on a foreign power of some sort had kind of always been there. And it's not like the Italians hadn't tried to federate. As you know, the Peace of Lodi, the Italic League, etc., made some videos about this, were all the attempt, especially in the face of the Ottoman rise in the East, and the French won in the West, because the end of the 100 Years' War is the same chronologically of the Turkish conquest of Constantinople, right, would immediately project them towards this realization that, yeah, they were after all people, right? The online space is very weird, as much as the claim that you sometimes find here and there that various European peoples would have not kind of existed because they were not politically united yet, and or they were divided, they controlled other lands, and so on. And if you actually make a comparison about sort of most European countries at the time, you realize that Italy had already, in spite of its political division, probably the most fully fledged sort of national culture, not in a unitary sense, again, in a political one, even in the same culture, even for how it reflected itself. But it was indeed actually the most civilized and also advanced country out there. And this is obvious because the language of modern Europe is Italian. All treatises, like in terms of science, think about, say, military engineering, art, literature, it's all about Italy at this point in history. You have to wait really the 18th century with the mid-17th, if anything, with France to really become the continentally hegemonic country in Europe. In part, this happened exactly because the French lost the Italian wars, but say it's not like the Spanish could fundamentally produce something in terms of the scale of Italian culture, even though they controlled a substantial part of the same peninsula. If anything, they drew overwhelmingly from that. So it's an enormous paradox that is perhaps even better substantiated by the observation of these arms development. Because in this series, basically, we take early modern armies of all countries. I think this is the first time we talk about Italy, as a matter of fact. And we look at mostly like the general picture, then in standalone videos, cavalry or artillery or infantry and so on. This time, Italian artillery happened. In theory, this series reaches the mid-17th century, but mostly here we're talking about the Italian wars, because there is this sense that basically whatever the Italian armies were at this point were not important. In any case, they were defeated or were not really independent, even though they operated always together with the French, with the Spanish, etc. But when we go look at the actually technical capacities, I mean, we were talking speak about Leonardo's prototypes, etc., we realize this beautiful paradox of political and strategical and sort of economical shortcoming in the face of there was all the mean to do that, but not enough of a political concentration to invest in a national military. There's even a famous passage at the end of Machiavelli's Prince that basically calls the Italian to arms against the barbarians and so on, and observes that, taken individually, Italians have actually and potentially the best among infantry, among artillery, etc., in all these various elements that can constitute a quite robust army to fence off the enemy. Politically, this was not really wanted by the leaders, because the leaders did simply not see this incumbent collapse of the peninsula. There wasn't, this is the real bottom line of it all, in a strictly historical, political, and national sense, that the peninsula was not simply conquerable. This is not like, I don't know, land of conquest, like you can see at some point I don't know, with the partition of Poland that is cancelled from them. These same Italian states remained, right, highly developed, very rich, even after the conquest, and unitarily continuing as such, right? There are some readjustments here and there, but you always have basically Venice, you have the Milanese that aren't, that's the biggest sort of, the ones probably were occupied by the Spanish, even though it was actually an imperial holding, and obviously the Habsburgs were sort of power sharing. You have Tuscany, you have the Papal States, you have Genoa, and so on. And in general, the same Italian political activity is very much exploiting all the rivalries that will continue. We've seen them also in the series, for example, about the Battle of Vienna and the whole diplomatic background to that. We really made lots of videos about that. That, of course, these were all active players, and that war was always kind of a costly business and so on. The moment which everything starts becoming obsolete is the 19th century. The 19th century is a moment in which Italy is truly lagging behind, and it will essentially up to the mid-20th century compared to sort of at least the top Western development, compared to countries like France or Britain and so on. And that's something which at that point is also interesting to study from a military point of view, because even there, it's not like they didn't have a military, they didn't participate in broader European affairs. Actually, I would like to make a video in a series about the Italian commanders of the Habsburgs throughout the 16th, the 17th, and even the 18th century, because we're talking some of the greatest commanders out there. I mean, just recently made some videos about Montecuccoli, and we will come back making them. There is really, we've seen Piccolomini in the series about the video actually about the commanders of the 30 Years' War. So we'll probably come back continuing the series about the Dutch revolt with Alexander Farnese and so on. To me, it's very interesting to cover this topic, because I think that, again, there is always the sense that whatever was happening in early modern warfare mostly privileged the Protestant Northwestern European, and in particular the English and the Dutch, right, or the Swedes later and so on. And powers like, even within probably the orbit of a broader military culture like the Spanish one, that was predominant, like in this case many tercios were also from Italy, from the various Spanish possessions in the peninsula and the islands, but even the same French one, or even the same Austrian one, right? And we have very often this blurred and false perspective on how advanced or not as power was. I think that really Italians are not researching much these topics. I mean, surely Mr. Africa at this point has been booming, quantitatively speaking, everywhere, but you always have this impression that I highlight in my channel continuously, that hyper specialization has rigged basically the entire global academic production. So you can have very serious good studies on this or that, even like in this case, for example, Italian city-states. But when it comes to having an overall view of how things were faring, there's a massive void. Today I will try to sort of gap this a little bit. Obviously, I'm going to talk about things that are really notorious, but if anything, putting them together for the sake of some example of, in order to articulate better this picture as more unitarily that it actually seems, right? As we started discussing from the year before last, really, and we will hopefully increasingly do, or even before actually, we started with the French national infantry of the Italian wars, because as you know, at that point it was mostly the Swiss that the French used, because they didn't want similarly to arm their people at home. And they were in part obviously right, right? You're not more experienced than a French king, high nobleman, understanding how dangerous it is to have some veterans there that can pick up arms against cavalry, especially in a moment like this. The aristocracy, I mean, when cavalry is beaten by pike and shot warfare so badly, right? So the Italian wars are really big. I want to make some battle videos at this point. They lasted overall, also in the broader European picture, and even abroad. I mean, in the rest of the world, between 1494 and 1559. There were this prolonged series of wars that devastated the Italian peninsula as well. Not as much as the Napoleonic Wars will, because the Napoleonic Wars are the ones that really sack a lot of, for example, the same Italian Renaissance art, classical antiquity, and so on. Much was even restored later from France. But in general, at this point, even the sense that Italy had simply collapsed to reform was not univocal. It was just like a big crisis, a big defeat overall. Single rulers, as far as single rulers could count their money in the purse and say, well, okay, but maybe what happened here was not that bad at the end of the day. And as you know, the Italian wars were triggered by the invasion of Italy in 1494 by Charles VIII of France, who sought to enforce his dynastic claim to the Kingdom of Naples through the Angevin inheritance. I hope that you know much more about the French Angevin, like also the later Neapolitan Angevin, than at least as much as in this West, the so-called English Angevins. We can't even say such a thing. Recently made a video about Robert the Wise, by the way, of Naples. And this French invasion of Italy quickly escalated to the broader struggle for dominance over the peninsula's fragmented states, pitting France against the rising Habsburg powers, primarily Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. The latter had a bit more problems, but again, the Spanish, especially as we have explained with my recent video about Gonzalo de Cordoba, the Gran Capitan, was the one that would go on founding probably early modern warfare. Right, pike and shot warfare, and basically setting the military standards for everybody involved. Right, and in particular for the Holy Roman Empire, the Germans, I mean the Catholic Habsburgs in particular, the same Italians. Right, Spanish military culture was dominant, very much present across all this great Catholic world. It was the most advanced still in Europe. And the Italian wars are very complicated to tell, even just in an eventual sense, with shifting alliances involving most major European players and nearly all Italian polities. The wars arose from dynastic rivalries, as we were pointing out, for Naples, as well as Milan, for that matter. I made a video about Gian Galeazzo Visconti that sort of explains a bit also like the Milanese connection with the French royalty. And we also can't help, obviously, to realize the weakness of Italy's independent city-states and kingdoms after the breakdown of the fragile peace of Lodi 1454 and the ambitions of foreign monarchs like Charles VIII, Louis XII, Francis I, was mostly the French. I mean, the entire point was stemming French invasion. And Emperor Charles V, right? Of course, the Spanish were already in Italy, in both Naples and Sicily, but I mean, France was at this point the giant that could actually win the war had, again, they invested in something more politically radical, and that would have, however, provided them with essentially the better infantry at that point, because simply France had more than Spain and the others. These wars are so important. I mean, they mark the transition in European warfare that we mostly understand as modernity in that field, highlighting innovations in gunpowder artillery, mobile field guns, and new fortifications. The trace italienne, that before Vauban was in fact the model, as we said before, for all military engineering in Europe, again, essentially created and built by Italian architects, polymaths, and so on, but at this point, mostly the benefits also of powers that came to rule over the Italians themselves. Here the paradox once again. And in fact, ultimately leading to the Spanish Habsburg dominance over much of Italy by the Peace of Cateau-Cambrésis in 1559. Throughout this period, the divided Italian states, Venice, the powerful maritime republic controlling vast mainland territories known as the terraferma, as well as overseas possessions, Naples, the Kingdom of Naples, ruled by the Aragonese dynasty and a major sovereign power, the Papal States, territories under more or less direct papal control in central Italy, Milan, the wealthy duchy, under the Sforza family, and Florence, the Republic, later under Medici influence, made extensive use of artillery. This is, I would like to stress the point. If you really look at their military model, that basically had been pioneering, again, the Western one until the previous generations. Really, the Venetian condotta in particular, we've seen also Corleone's work recently, so to say. And the Burgundian bands of ordnance were the most advanced Western militaries at the time. Never mind what happened between the Burgundians and the Swiss. There is a reason why that happened. Those wars, I have a particular idea on them, and I will discuss it when we'll talk about that again. It's not like, again, from a day to another, the history of warfare changed. In fact, what I just said regarding the idea of a modern conception of the Italian wars is, as we've seen also for many other, also later modern wars, somehow anachronistic. Essentially, this was just a continuation of the same basic medieval military organization that will last up until the French Revolution or the end of World War I, if you really want to be precise about the foundational institutions of the same and the methods of recruitment in army and so on. The fact that there is a core of professional forces that are increasingly more tied to a sort of more of a politically cohesive power. It's wrong even to say that the state was born here. That's another misconception. Like, medieval state was basically of the same mold we see now, right? The latter was just more concentrated, but there isn't a threshold we can say this is a state, this is not a state, right? If we're talking about in civil law, the state becoming the sole source of law, you have to wait for Napoleon, really. In the same way, like the core of professional / mercenary forces plus militias, and some ethnic troops sometimes, is the same you find throughout all the later Middle Ages, the early modern one, and there isn't much to convince anyone otherwise, except modernists would like to make you believe that. I made multiple videos showing, including, by the way, that, for example, early 14th century armies were actually bigger, but before the plague, than even most of these 16th century ones. What do you think the Swiss armies of the 16th century were? They were actually more advanced, more complex than, let's say, I don't know, the ones the same communes had in Italy, where the Swiss also learned how to fight in a bigger scale of the early 14th century. Right? Say Italian wars armies were fairly small compared to that, and people have sort of no clue because of the military revolution, all this categoristic essentialism about this is a modern army, but it's a complete pile of BS. Everything that is sold to you as quote unquote modern is BS in different ways. Historiographically speaking, in particular, up to the 19th century, there isn't any radical change in the fundamentals of politics, of warfare, of society. Just a gradual compaction. And there is no sort of major step in between. You can't say, oh, like, that's the watershed or whatever. As a consequence, if you actually look at the Italian history of firearms technology, again, the Italians were far ahead. These were the first guys who had widespread firearms use compared to any other. Already from the 70s, the 80s of the 14th century, 1/3 of Italian infantry was armed with handguns. It is really advanced. Again, handguns of the time were not as performing as crossbows still as a whole, but gradually that they took over And even if they were present in that proportions, because they already were that effective, as a matter of fact. The art of war was also a bit changing, telling the truth, in different ways, and shrinking mostly to a smaller but more professional army, so you can understand also an increasing use of artillery. Some Italian centers were properly specialized in artillery production. For example, the Este of Ferrara had apparently the best foundries, the best artillery pieces. But again, they were small, right? They didn't have the scale displayed by the French, for example, of Charles VIII, that had basically reunited basically all of France, had put together as many artillery as they could, and simply with a sheer massive firepower that had overwhelmed everybody. It's a bit like what happened also during the Napoleonic Wars at the beginning, right? It's not like the French conscripts were necessarily better than the old they weren't individually, than the professional armies of the Ancien Regime. But the size, the capacity of the French state at that point, and again, that was always, again, mostly pioneering this military step forwards, that are at that point real step forwards, overwhelm the neighbors that either sort of crumble or adapt, as a matter of fact. Here, even, things are much more gradual, right? And all these Italian states did actually make extensive use of artillery. The Venetians had been pioneering this, for example, at sea, right? Already from the 14th century, you see that they were the most naval artillery advanced power, together with the Mamluks of Egypt. As a matter of fact, they already had immediately, as long as they had guns, they had already explosive shells, etc. So again, never make the childish mistake of presuming that technology wins wars, because that's probably the dumbest thing that everybody can ever say about the history of the art of war. It's doctrine, all right? And it is also proper availability, and in this sense, politics more than else. And we explain in the introduction essentially what we're talking about. In fact, the real problem of the Italians is not like they did not make extensive use of artillery, but they lacked the strong power concentration that characterized their major European competitors, such as France and Spain in particular. All right. By the end of and artillery, obviously, we will see now, was not really the game changer per se, right? It's mostly pike and shot, but sort of the shot intended mostly like handguns. And before artillery will make like a crushing impact in the history of the art of war, will take other centuries, really. The French entered Italy with all that artillery because they rightly thought that they could essentially bring all the various fortified Italian cities just to knees without even needing to, or just firing one shot, showing what a prolonged bombardment could do to have them surrender. Right, and that's also the reason why largely Italians simply let the French pass through central northern Italy to reach Naples, right? And as I was saying at the very beginning, like kind of using the French to sort of to for example side against out of a specific neighbor domain. We've seen this between Pisa and Florence, for example. Again, this will actually not go anywhere. So these wars will trigger for example, further political fragmentation of the Italian peninsula. On the contrary, it will actually recompact it further towards also more autocratic rule and so on. Now, by the end of the 15th century, I have some video incoming, especially on this topic in general art of war. There were particular innovations, some signs that you can pick to realize that the Renaissance was kicking in. And definitely artillery presented one of the most striking ones. In fact, this arm was actually still in its early developmental phase and remained severely limited in its practical use. But mass started making the difference. So again, it's not even technology. Actually, Italians would have had better artillery technology than the French at this point. But the French had way more artillery. And that does mean a lot, right? In fact, in particular, the Italians had all these kind of geniuses, prototypes, testing, all this stuff, but no actual funds to invest in a widespread production of this artillery, and simply not a society, not a political entity that could simply control that in a unitary sense. No true organized artillery branch, for example, existed. This was admittedly true for any European army at the time. Artillery was still considered, like you could consider it in ancient or medieval times, it was just something you put in the baggage train and you used to storm this or that fortress. There were still older technologies used, by the way. Indeed, gunpowder artillery was a relatively recent innovation across the continent. From the 20s of the 15th century, basically every updated army would have to display that. We have seen in videos like the Battle of Molinella and Caravaggio how the Italians had already there used, made some of the earliest use, in that case, of wheeled artillery, like on carts that could be shifted across the lines during this engagement, sort of peppering the enemy lines. That is very interesting, because these condottieri battles were very often about sort of back and forth, hit and run, at least along the line, because armies at this point in the history of the art of war were mostly developed in width, or they were essentially smaller than before, so they just had a single line in the front, not always, but still. And they mostly developed in width. And at that point, rather than some deep artillery shot, you needed smaller, more maneuverable artilleries along the line. This is something we've seen also, as a matter of fact, in the videos about the French artillery, like the Courbevoie reform, right after the 7 Years' War. The French at that point had a giantism complex from all the wars of conquest from the age of the Sun King, for just smashing fortifications from the distance, but they had not developed, like the Prussians and the Austrians, some smaller artillery that could be more effective against infantry at a close range. So here, actually, you could think almost the same. The Italian armies had exactly what was needed for open field engagements against one another, simply because artillery warfare at that point was still sort of limited in potential, and most artillery was more proficiently used at this point, mostly in siege warfare. And they had also guns for that, but just not to the overwhelming scale that would allow the French to literally invade the peninsula. The Italians at this point did not have any reason, but nor capacity to, say, invade simply, I don't know, France or Spain. It would have been a major political problem and backlash, and mostly you can already see how they were being compressed into remaining mostly in a defensive situation. This stems from also different socio-cultural reasons that date back to the communes and how these countries had developed mostly on a urban world, differently from, for example, France or Spain. They were still largely feudal countries, and it was somehow easier, again, just to recruit peasants from all over this immense territory to put together a decent force that you could essentially militarize and send out there without too many socio-economical backlash, right, from this sort of rich, affluent third estate communities of the Italian city-states that had also an interland, that also had, again, an important extension, but also so much productive activity locally that had not really provided with a need to even develop a military other than simply hiring the mercenaries that they could, in this sense, absorb and not to maintain forever, right? They could discharge this band at will. And those were actually still Italian, but they had paradoxically been developing mostly as armies, self-employed armies, or at least sort of self-structured armies employed, like lent to these various powers, to something more permanent, like we see in the Venetian condotta that basically engulfed them into northeastern Italy. But and don't get me wrong, because if you look at the core of, say, I don't know, the Milanese Ducal Guard or something, we're talking about massive forces, right? They were really big, but they were still mostly based on a knightly retinue mentality. Pike and shot, large masses of infantry were not there, right? Equally so, they resembled more like the French, we could say, also because most Europeans still fought, like they will keep fighting, especially the more north and east you go in Europe, more or less in the same way before they also started investing in pike and shot warfare in any consistent sense, right? So everything was in reality fairly normal, right? Including the fact that no really particularly advanced artillery parks had been developed. The first ones to pioneer this had been the Burgundians, because they had lots of Flemish craftsmen that, in this sense, can provide with an analogy with the Italians, because the Italians, they were even richer than the Flemish, and those urban centers had been producing lots of guns for defense. As we've seen in a recent video about Burgundian warfare, the Flemish got defeated throughout their entire history, from the so-so victory of Mont-Pavel until the so-so victory of Guinegate. That we're talking, again, 150 years of being taking kicks in the teeth without any exception whatsoever against feudal armies of the Dukes of Burgundy. They were French armies that, however, became so rich, controlling these places, they could also put together so much artillery from these communes. It was an imperfect system, but they also had the first park of artillery that also the same French royal, we're talking about the French crown, French royal army, would take an inspiration from, as we see the next generation, in fact, in Italy itself with Charles VIII. Now, speaking of the Italians, a fundamental distinction must be drawn between heavy artillery, the so-called artiglierie grosse, and the light ones, the artiglierie minute. The heavy pieces were represented by gigantic bombers. That was in tune of the time. Think about Orban monster bomber sold to the Ottomans. Orban exploded together with that bomber. The Italians did not, nobody in the West actually had anything like the Turks used, but those were literally trying to smash into places like Rhodes, Belgrade, massively overly fortified strongholds. They needed really this enormous, let's say, firepower to even approach to begin with across all the Mediterranean. But there were, just like, think about the Mount Meg in Edinburgh and so on, like, it's plenty of these monster bombers. The Italians had the same kind, 5 or 6 meters long on average, usually made in 2 or 3 screwed together sections, very typical, with calibers ranging from 30 to 50 centimeters. These fired stone bowls rested on very basic carriages and required large teams of oxen to transport them on special wagons. These were probably used against fortifications. Already there were different types of artillery in the West, and the same Italians were pioneering them. We will see now slightly better, but one of the best were the serpentines, were sort of more ballistically performance, were more precise. They had a longer range, and they were adapting to the same trace italienne that was, as you know, reducing basically the height of the walls, was creating some different embankments to probably avoid being directly hit, like in a sort of almost straight as a still parabolic trajectory shot can be. This more pioneering artillery, in fact, was grouped within the light types, right, including colubrines, serpentines, cerbottane, passavolanti, and falconets, types that in the smaller calibers were not clearly separated from large stand-mounted arquebuses, the so-called grossi archibugi a cavalletto, literally like with a place with a fork, but also, right, not that distant from the bigger artilleries for that matter. They were smaller, so you could sort of experiment more with them. The smaller the technology at this point, the easier to handle and to test, to just like have more spares. And as we've seen, just adapting better to the more habitual Italian warfare. We've seen this type of guns, like even in that case, in a more rudimentary Central European situation with the Hussites. Right. For that matter, in comparison, say, had the Hussites, Wagenburgs had been fielded, like, I don't know, in France or Italy, it would have been smashed by the artillery that was there. Central Europe is really another world. what is fascinating about all this is that from some mobile artillery, the same musket later would develop, right? Some guns developed from sort of more handgun types, others from in fact like heavier ones to become handguns instead, right? In general, these lighter guns were reasonably mobile, easy to move, cast in bronze and mounted on 2 or 4 wheel carriages. Again, Italy had a very advantageous position with regard to light artillery. Cartridge loading, caricamento a cartoccio, so known, appeared around 1483. And there was constant effort to enhance the mobility of the pieces as well as their aiming mechanisms for direction and elevation, right? It's not like it took any particular effort to get this stuff, but let's say in general, the fact that it's earlier documented in Italy that the best pieces are cast there and so on. Remember that the Italians are also the first to actually have larger amounts of probably of guns documented in the history of firearms, right? I also discussed this. You will find the links, as a matter of fact, in the top fix comment down below, right? Largely, again, Western European firearm technology, military technology in general had largely gone in parallel. The discriminant was largely who did have more resources to actually field them in larger numbers, right? And initially, in fact, the Italians were with the French and the English to have the larger amounts of artillery in the very early phase. But you can go even back into the time of Trebuchet and realize that, documentarily speaking, we are showed essentially which were the powers that normally had the possibility of fielding a more structured amount of these pieces, right? These light guns were employed both in attacking and defending fortresses and encampments, and also in proper battlefield engagements, again, as we've seen at Molinella, Caravaggio, and hopefully in other Condottieri era battles soon. That's really the age in which field artillery becomes noticeable. You can't say sort of relevant in a bigger sense. Again, artillery is a fully fledged army, combined arms operation for open field engagement. It's something that you can't just start seeing but much later in time. But already at this point, it's there, and it finds its first sort of systematic documentation in Italy in this lighter mobile fashion. You should always be able to measure here the civilizational scale. For example, we made lots of videos about Hussite tactics, and we observed there that it's not much like they were particularly more advanced in any military sense. Actually, they were normally more primitive and backward, even than the armies that they successfully defeated. This is true also for the Swiss against the House of Burgundy-Valois forces, as we were noticing before. But in fact, not everything that is more sophisticated is more advanced. Think about the Romans versus the Hellenistic kingdoms. The latter had all kind of technological capacity, refinement, armored elephants, sighted chariots, enormous catapults, and all this stuff. But they got defeated by the Romans, that were sort of rougher and not even necessarily less technologically advanced at some point, at least in potential, but simply investing in something else. In fact, again, I reiterate that artillery, even during the Italian wars, wasn't the game changer, right? It's pike and shot combined arms that are, and even though we've seen, for example, in the video about Giovanni de' Medici, that Condottieri was killed by a falconet shot that had already wounded him. Not the same shot, obviously, but as an arm the previous year. You have Bayard, who has his spine broken by an arquebus shot. All this kind of, we will talk next about Jacques de la Langue against those Flemish in the Burgundian Wars in a siege, right? So there is a bit the sense that times were changing because knights were killed by these weapons, etc. But at the same time, it was mostly like a princely world that was, in fact, creating even pike and shot warfare, mastering that, not sort of infantry, free people, whatever. No, actually, the world was sinking in terms of individual liberty during the Renaissance. We've also seen an interesting level of fortification and, in this sense, sort of batteries used to preliminarily batter the enemy lines before the assault to the same enemy fortifications at the Battle of Caravaggio, where the Milanese and the Venetians had been probably fortifying against one another, circumvallation around Caravaggio and counter circumvallation to defend against the enemy that had come to break off the siege. So again, things that had always existed, but at this point were sort of increasing in importance also because there was more artillery firepower. So the picture was very different, however, in Italy when siege artillery in general was involved. As late as the 70s and the 80s, in the 15th century, for example, old trebuchets and mangonels were still found along bombards. This is also normal, telling the truth. One of my very old videos was exactly about this long sunset of trebuchet warfare that continued exactly until this time. Even the famous and most powerful Sforza artillery in Milan, developed under dukes like Francesco and his successors who invested heavily in foundries and engineers for bronze and iron pieces, was extremely slow and enormously cumbersome and could fire only stone projectiles. It's not like the French crossing the Apennine, say even at the gate to get the hell out of there before Fornovo, etc., were that sort of speedier, swifter. Like actually, there are incredibly interesting passages that I documented in some videos from the chronicles of the time. It's that this was a titanic enterprise. It was incredibly difficult to move with that enormous artillery park. The greatest problem was literally mobility, logistics. On average, armies possess no more than 2, 4, or 6 of these colossal guns. When you look at the Italian landscape, even in siege warfare, siege contexts, colossal guns which were hard to place properly in battery and to shield from enemy observation and fire, or at least, again, there would be a way to do so. The fact that you had that firepower at hand against the fortress was always, in any case, expandable. Right, there wasn't. If you find certain guns, like in war, we know that they did work to that extent. Right, it cannot be excluded that attempts at improvement were already being made. In 1476, Orso degli Orsini, a condottiero and military reformer serving various Italian lords, these were Roman condottieri. The Papal States, unironically, had literally the strongest amount and best condottieri. But since it was, in fact, they were papal states, were sort of loosely kept together under the Pope. You see, politically, they could have, had they been united, say like Milan, they would have taken over Italy. There is no doubt about this. But something else was going on, and for this reason, also you find this Roman central Italian most like Umbria, and we've seen it also with Braccio, etc. Many other famous names. Think about the Montefeltro, etc. Were literally the best condottieri. You find them hired all over Italy. Well, Orso degli Orsini proposed for his own army only 2 large bombards. We are again in the last quarter of the 15th century. Bombards firing stone projectiles of 300 and 200 pounds, but cast as single piece rather than 3. With thicker barrel and breech, delivering the shot with much greater penetrating power. In essence, they would produce the same effect as the biggest bombards while weighing only half as much. Right? They were starting to step up in that sense. You know, the bombard basically declined in this period, in fact, also in the rest of Europe. And this was the correct direction. But advancement along this path in Italy was very slow, or at least there was no much interest in investing in artillery because in general the army's capacities were mostly tailored on some provincial scale of military theory and strategic objective. The real breakthrough occurred later with the ability also from technology to cast large solid iron balls using lead assistance, a technique adopted on a wide scale in France, for example. The cannons of Charles VIII, firing 50-pound solid iron balls of about 10 centimeters caliber, truly represented something new and superior compared to Italian bombards because they were much faster to reload. And you understand here that even though they were smaller and they shot smaller projectiles, at the same time their agility, right, the shorter reload time, the greater versatility, the fact that you could rely on multiple pieces at a time, even for incidents, because they could also explode. I mean, these were still very primitive firearms in general, but they were much better than the bigger bombard of the previous centuries that had basically dominated the sort of the siege landscapes in terms of firepower technology. And in the case of the French, of the Italian wars, in fact, now an army could transport 20 or 30 pieces instead of 2, 4, or 6 with considerably less difficulty. In proportion, you can have even more weight but more evenly distributed in all these various pieces. Even just logistically, it's much easier to operate. Both heavy and light artillery were indeed drawn exclusively by horses, never by oxen or buffaloes in the case of the French. The well-known mobilization plan for the Sforza army 1472-74 included no fewer than 1,000 bronze or iron spingarde, that would be the spring guard, mounted 2 by 2 on mobile carriages, along with 500 organetti, the scioppetti, each containing 8 fire mouths. Right, these were essentially organ guns, and you see them also in the drawings that I took from Leonardo, and they are very sort of notorious. They were used also elsewhere. We don't even fully know how they operated, in the sense like how did they fire, in which circumstance, were they reloaded, what kind of fire was preferred in general. But in any case, the options were also relatively limited. So in the also called recall project by Orso Orsini, in 47-6, the army was to achieve 100 large cerbottane that were only from 5 centimeters caliber, but still basically following the same adaptability versatility path, and the same number of medium ones, not including the medium cerbottane stands, allocated to the infantry as well. And you understand there, basically you arrive at basically a handgun if you reduce too much. This is what we've seen also in the video about Giovanni de' Medici, that it was better, it was useless at that point, given also his funds, to try to take on the enemy, the Landsknechten, with thousands of infantrymen. Too costly. You could pepper them and harass them with mounted gunners. And again, it was naturally a limited choice. Had Giovanni de' Medici had enough funding, he would have fought the same way. But for example, the Germans had been at some point defeated in mounted combat against those handgunners. And so you see, for example, how you can harass their supply lines if your cavalry is superior and your skirmish capacity is capable to attrition a bigger army, like in that case. So it's all about how you adapt to the circumstance. Orsini himself observed that against cavalry, the latter pieces, the cerbottane, had almost the same effectiveness as the larger ones. This is interesting because it's said normally that at this point artillery was mostly a nuisance as mitraille, loaded and to annoy the horses and just scratch and wound the unarmored parts. But already at this point, artillery was actually used also against cavalry. In a sense, as we've seen, the smaller pieces were also tendentially, used as handguns. So remember that the amount of joules unleashed by an explosion is really much bigger than anything that, in that sense, in terms of, for example, handguns, like the more traditional missile weapons had managed to use. So they had always been effective to an extent, and as we've seen also in the case of Giovanni de' Medici, actually a man-at-arms could be taken out that easily, right, by a falconet shot in that case, the same for Bayard, etc. And so here we basically appreciate what these guns really were. By the way, if you're interested in what Orsini was talking about, there is this memorial stating literally, quote, "And 4 cerbottani are enough to rout a squadron from a position or dislodge men from a defense, which otherwise would never be dislodged or removed. The cerbottani on horseback or on stands are those on carts, on wheeled carriages are the most general artillery there is. The cerbottani with every shot take at least one man from the defense and hit a horse, knocking it to the ground. Thus, they are advantageous both in offense and in defense, as can be seen not only against wooden defenses, but they break through the merlons, that is to say the battlements too, right? And when you look at the Italian wars and these guns in action, just 20 years later, 30 years later, at the Battle of Ravenna, for example, 1512, realize that they were really killing the noblemen, killing those who counted, right? There is a growing importance of artillery. There are many instances. There are battles like, Marignano, in which there is a bloodbath of Swiss taken isolated without French support in front of Venetian artillery. That's a massive bloodbath, right? And that's also what, fortunately, paradoxically, helped the Swiss getting out of the Italian wars and to remain sort of developing their own financial civilization in their own alpine shelter, so to say. And the sort of guns of various calibers were naturally used everywhere at this point on land, at sea for sieges, field battles, fortification purposes. They were really being fitted everywhere with increasing capacity. Several Italian powers, especially Venice and Naples, integrated artillery into their strategies for territorial defense and control. These were objectively at this point the more sort of doctrinally suited. Venice, again, really pioneering naval warfare, being really a superpower in and of herself. At sea, Naples being a major landmass with an enormous army, as a matter of fact, really having all the resources and capacities, and they also competed with one another in the Adriatic, for that matter, really testing the same strongholds. And normally, every time there was a crisis, Venice in the south, Venice tended to seize all the coastal strongholds with their ships and then await, right? The interland would offer them something to get away from it, also against threat of more concentrated power to dislodge them. But everything was gruelingly brutal, right? Italians relied on exceptionally skilled Renaissance engineers who customized cannons to meet the particular requirements of each city-state. Very much ad hoc, you can imagine. Also greatly experimenting. Again, Leonardo being surely the best example. Emphasizing siege warfare and defensive applications over mass production, though, as we said since the beginning. Among the most prominent states, Venice maintaining a standing army of 4,400 men. This was, by the way, a relatively light amount, right? And we're talking men-at-arms, not in the sense of knights, but sort of also apparently infantry, like that what most in the coastal possessions had. But the Venetians would deploy tens of thousands of men at the Battle of Agnadello, for example, so thanks largely again to their condotta de fanti provvisionati, and deployed on that very occasion, on May the 14th, 1509, 29 siege guns and 120 field guns, right, facing 67 advanced French cannons. Interestingly enough, in the battle, part of the War of the League of Cambrai, where a coalition including France crushed Venetian forces, highlighted artillery's critical role in defending both mainland terra firma and distant territories such as Cyprus. So things did not go well for Venice, but not because of the composition of her army at large, right, for broader reasons. Of course, like, armies were important in that sense, but it's mostly how you use them or what other contingental factors in the broader international strategic situation exist. Excuse me, I drank a little. As we know, and seen heavy siege guns batter enemy fortifications, you would carry them with you. This is also true for some earlier artilleries. Some were built even on the spot of siege satyrs. For example, the major trebuchet beams were stored in the communal chambers and sort of broke because they were very complex in construction and they couldn't quite be simply replaced or rebuilt. The frames, yes, but the ropes, etc., could be made on the spot, but the beams, not quite. And so with cannons in general, things evolved along that pattern, because obviously you don't just create a gun and leave it there for some reason. Lighter field guns provided this essential battlefield maneuverability. And speaking of Venice, all these weapons were managed by the Arsenale, the famous 12th century shipyard and arms factory in Venice, still the largest in Europe, logistically supporting rapid deployment. At Agnadello, for example, those 149 guns were brought into action in short order. However, as we were hinting at before, poor tactical coordination combined with a torrential downpour that turned the ground into deep mud severely restricted effectiveness, preventing the Venetians from countering French fire and playing a major part in their defeat. The outcome led Venice to shift its focus towards highly mobile infantry armed with firearms at that point, rather than depending on artillery for open field engagements. This is also quite interesting because if you think about it, that's also a bit the future, right? That's what's happening all around. More shot among the footmen. Naples, with the capacity to mobilize up to 18,000 troops in these years, made, and more, because potentially, again, even much larger armies could be levied from all these various European powers, but there was also just so much financial contingency in a given moment, and also proportionality. Like, you don't want to overspend or to create even more logistical issues, especially when you have this heavy artillery used in both siege and coastal defense. Southern Italy obviously having a pretty robust coastal fortification system at this point. There is Ottoman piracy, etc. So just think the costs of that for a country like Italy that has like 3,000 kilometers of coastline. That means enormous amount of costs for its defense with the Ottomans around. Naples equipped galleys and observation towers with such guns to combat piracy, a tactic obviously also employed by Venice, the Papal States. In the Papal States, Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI, and a ruthless condottiero, as we've seen in the misadventures of Caterina Sforza in the video about Giovanni de' Medici, effectively used siege cannons between 1499 and 1503 to capture castles across Emilia-Romagna, supported by engineers expert in fortress design. That was mostly paid by his father from Rome, and it was a pretty swift and effective display of artillery power by Italian standards of the year. Milan fielding 15,000 troops, and Florence probably maintaining artillery primarily for urban defense and siege operations, were more cautious. Again, they could also field more, but at this point there is just, a general prudence and emphasis on defense. In Milan, the Commissario Generale sopra gli alloggiamenti was responsible for logistical support. Right, general commissary over basically the lodgings, the supplies, etc. Key advances in artillery came from Italian engineers Francesco Di Giorgio Martini. This was a Sienese polymath who served as military engineer to the Duke of Urbino, and others, authoring treatises on fortifications, cannon design, and ballistics. And Niccolò Tartaglia, mathematician who pioneered scientific ballistics in his 1537 work Nova Scientia, applying mathematics to projectile trajectories, gun elevation, and range finding. These are sort of very interesting works. For example, Martini's Trattato di Architettura Civile e Militare and Tartaglia's Quesiti et Invenzioni supplied crucial guidance on cannon construction, deployment, and integration into fortified systems. Fortresses specifically engineered to withstand artillery proved highly successful, as demonstrated by the very small number of successful sieges between 1521 and 1528, which, again, shows how even Italian fortifications at this point were actually up to date and were properly pioneering military engineering that was basically soon imitated by all Europeans afterwards. This is quite fascinating because all these military engineers were also alchemists. We have a series on alchemy for that matter that counts. There is all a incredibly, again, technological, scientific insight in Renaissance Italy, as you well know. And much of this resource is invested for the sake of military capacity. We see also how these Italian states were all interdependent and very much intercommunicating at the same time. You see there a Sienese polymath that serves the Duke of Urbino, that is basically semi-independent but also vassal of the Papal dominion. There is, again, think about Leonardo's service in Milan and then in France itself. So these people have also a political, a social, a cultural background that is worth at some point. We could make even, I don't know, military history of Leonardo's contribution. We've never really seen this, like how much of that really worked and how amazing was it or not. We have to talk more about the Renaissance because it's an incredible concentration, especially in these very decades, because things began to cool off a little bit later in the century. From a strictly sort of eruptive sense. There were further crises of different kind, both political, economical. The Italian wars were an explosion of so much potential in all its brutality and bloodbaths that we have been documenting here. Now, naturally, the fact that artillery had a dual role in both offense and defense mirrors the tendentional symmetry of warfare practice. Like warfare is asymmetric by definition, and so everything is about trying to just increase the gap when it's in your favor and decrease it when it's not, right? But it's exactly in this highly competitive scenario, the most militarily intense theater in Europe at this point, that designs were carefully adjusted to local conditions. For example, transportation, like road, bridge, and some ports. Consider that Italy had a pretty advanced infrastructure in that sense. So paradoxically also served the invading armies. In naval warfare, Venice and Naples armed their light galley squadrons, the Squadra Leggera, and heavier sailing vessels, the Squadra Pesante, with large caliber guns. If you're interested, I made a video about 17th century Venetian ships and their development at that point, also by the hiring of Dutch and English vessels and their crews. Here we're in a different time. These weapons were indispensable for coastal protection, obviously, and safeguarding trade routes, particularly Venice's important Levantine commerce, threatened by the Ottomans, but not only. Coastal towers fitted with artillery were established across Venice, Naples, the Papal States, Sardinia, and Sicily to deter piracy and hostile fleets. Compared to the more uniform artillery organizations of France and Spain, that were the most advanced in Europe for that matter, Italian artillery suffered from a lack of standardization, and except in Venice and Milan, from excessive dependence on mercenaries, which created serious problems for consistent training and operational development on the longer run, and even just of cost sustainability. The standardization issue was the bigger one. When you look at, again, at the rest of Europe, it's not like in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, the Balkans, things were more advanced at all, right? We're here looking at the paradox of Italy as the most advanced Western country that, however, has less military capacity than France and Spain, that are bigger powers in general, but also because they can concentrate a critical mass given their political unity in more effective ways and having a greater tendency towards the availability of more standard pieces rather than even just technical standardization per se. Right? This thing of the issue of standardization will last for a very long time, basically until the 18th century, by different degrees. But for example, for Venice, the difficulties experienced at Agnadello made worse by inadequate coordination and adverse weather, as we've seen, revealed the challenges of incorporating artillery into the fragmented condottieri-led military system. It was essentially still a medieval, knightly, feudal system. As we said at the beginning, it's literally what also, the French or the Spanish one was, right? But the Italians suffered, again, this scale issue and sort of more provincial political autonomy that, however, had failed them at creating something more cohesive that could oppose countries that, again, had the Italians been united, would have not stood a chance, but that now were perfectly capable of entering the peninsula, taking advantage of the situation. In open pitch battles, artillery usually played a secondary role behind infantry and cavalry, obviously enough. At this point, cavalry is finally being battered by infantry, mostly because of pike and shot warfare. Cavalry charges are still very much there. They will keep remaining up to the late 19th century in very strong fashion, as a matter of fact, but with ups and downs. And the tendency towards the mid-16th century was probably the peak of sort of suppression of cavalry capacity until, again, essentially the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, World War I. And so at that point, artillery was mostly supporting the bulk of infantry, as always, as it would always remain, even in a broader sense. And this is a pattern reinforced by Venice's post-Agnadello emphasis on mobile infantry. And nevertheless, artillery remained vital for conducting sieges, strengthening fortifications, as we've seen, some amphibious operations, drawing effectively on Italy's distinguished engineering heritage to defend its territories. And so today we just conceptualized this picture. At some point we'll have to go a bit more in depth with how much artillery, not really much. If you really study, again, the major battles of the Italian wars in this stage, you realize that the Italians were mostly accompanying forces of the bigger powers. They had smaller armies, and consequently their artillery was not so crucial. They had good troops at large. They, again, supported well. They had, even in specific terms, high quality, but they were contained, right? And as such, like also their artillery, that probably also did its job at that scale, is overshadowed by the general picture. And at the same time, by scale, telling us, of course, that the Italians were not playing that bigger games that the French and the Spanish could do, but not because of artillery, but because of the entire sort of hierarchy, political situation, international situation. Again, most Italian powers would remain independent with their own armies that will keep following essentially some condottieri pattern even further, even though things were reformed. Again, you find very updated military like the Venetian one that suffers the defeat of Agnadello, that is also not much of a structural one because of the weakness of artillery per se, but a general balance that even trying to reconstruct from early 16th century sources is never going to be, okay, we will fully know how things actually went, right? We will come back making videos about, probably from primary sources, about early modern battles. The only truth for those we have more comprehensive analysis because the number of sources starts being larger on average. But if you look at this era, you realize that also humanism it was already the product of people who were detached a bit from the battlefields, differently from the communal era. And so you have mostly stories of how, I mean, the author that was not there, that was not necessarily even, particularly experienced in military matters, would say, I don't know, cavalry fared well there, and there instead it was not good or whatever. But we don't have this overwhelming notion of how true that could be. Like if you look at the Battle of Fornovo, basically the Italians managed to oblige like the French to retreat. There, it's also a battle where people debate who won, who lost. Tactically speaking, the Italians had the upper hand, but overall they also didn't quite achieve much for different reasons. But there you see that in theory they had the means properly to cope with the same French army at that point. So it's not ever much matter of military quality, but of political force, which is obviously reflected in the military. But in a sense, people often mistake it for some kind of, inherent, instinctual thing. There is hardly anything more counter-instinctive than warfare, right? That is mostly the product of civilization. And I think that the paradox of Renaissance Italy during the Italian wars is incredibly fascinating and dramatically understudied as far as I truly like. In order to find even any bibliographical reference about this, it's a bit of an adventure. And even, I mean, it's not like there isn't, because a lot is actually written about the Italian wars, but when it gets to, especially to Italian artillery, so Italian states artillery, you don't find much. You don't find much, even in properly in specialized publishing, etc. Of course, like there is more about the French. There is more about. I made a video about that, for example, talking about artillery, and again looking at Charles VIII's expedition. There, you have a lot really about French artillery in that instance, with the enormous logistical difficulties that were, however, worth it evidently. So again, it makes you think, because today, especially, like, if you want, as I said before, hyper-specialistic attention towards something, you normally find it. But even about that, there isn't probably much. And my intuition is that you have to go to archives, because chronicles do not really talk more, say that they have already been browsed, and never so entirely. Narrative sources are very underrated, especially for tactical reconstruction. So I'm sure that from there, like if you want to write a PhD thesis on that, like it would be a very interesting idea. But if we're talking in general, like something more specific about what kind of guns they had, how many, etc., I'm sure that probably it would emerge that Italians had even sort of pretty darn good artillery. It's just they didn't have enough numbers to make the difference to begin with. So that would add up, right? Because here it seems as if they wouldn't be even enough developed regarding that. However, it is true that given that their contingents were relatively smaller, or at least most Italian states were not and would not probably make the military effort, let's say better, that we see, for example, we mentioned the Venetian defeat of Agnadello with tens of thousands of men. It was enormous, right? But still pretty much fitting, again, just northeastern Italy, basically. And it's, of course, also maritime income. You realize that by that scale, so you don't need bigger guns. And it's a paradox, as we were saying before, that the Ottomans, for example, that were indeed pioneering gunpowder technology. For example, granulation of powder was the single major step forward until basically the bayonet, that is not even technically firearm technology just per se, were so advanced. We're not, however, technically as advanced as, say, in this case, the Italians, the Renaissance, right? They didn't have that. They didn't have such a socioeconomically thriving society like the Western ones, but they would make, for example, they didn't have really a pike element. They had a shot element, especially in the Janissaries, but mostly they had feudal and steppe armies, sort of a straight mix. But when they had to besiege massive fortifications, they were used to bring these monster bombards that required a shocking logistical capacity that, however, they could sustain because they had just an immense empire. There was also basically just the Balkans and Anatolia in direct control sense. We made a video about the actual numbers of the Ottoman armies in the early modern era. But in this sense, it wouldn't make sense to invest in the monster gun that everybody would see if you were an Italian city-state at this point. When I say city-state, again, it doesn't mean a city. It means the central city governing places like, I don't know, the entirety of Tuscany or almost Venice, northeastern Italy, Milan, the northwest, etc. The point, though, is that also monster guns, while more sort of outstanding, are not the norm either, right? And regarding that hierarchy, it's barely clear, even at this point in history, how much smaller guns existed, what they looked like. You can't be lucky to find condotta contracts or commissions for purchasing or construction, but hardly you will know or see or understand what even just narrative sources are that on which we base ourselves to reconstruct battles were saying basically about this artillery. And this is true also for the other for the other armies in a sense. So it's not the non-Italian ones. So it's interesting, it's difficult, but this is a first step. I'm sure that nobody has quite treated. Let me check. Obviously, I'm sure that nobody has ever made a video about this topic, because not even publications exist. Italian artillery of Italian wars. There is my video about the French National Infantry of the Italian wars. And all the rest is like, I don't know, World War II and the Profession of Arms that I was talking about the other day as a movie. Giovanni de' Medici. And nothing else, obviously, because nobody really cares about the stuff to begin with. And probably not going to get many views, but we have also to restore a little bit. Now here, for example, there are, this is cute, like, but this is maybe are not the Italians. There are some figurines, some models, dioramas, and that's usually like, okay, I talked about war games and how very often this is, the rest is all World War II. In another video of mine about Lodi and surroundings, yeah. Well, what can you do? I'm glad that in any case we talk more about this period, because we really missed that. I always felt the Italian wars up to a couple last year, I'd say, weren't so. This is the 6th video about the Italian wars, interestingly enough. So we're continuing. We'll get there. We will stiffen our content about this. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.